Trump likes a winner, and Zelensky and Ukraine have shown that they can hold their own, and Russia's not making a tremendous amount of progress militarily. So I think that changed the situation.
I mean, there was all this warm fuzziness around the two presidents meeting, but Zelensky still came with an ask for weapons, and I'm not sure that he got it. Hi, Bernd. Well, we are into the thick of summer. So, for the next few weeks, each of us is on holidays. This week, Sumi's away. So, the mantle of the president's path is in our hands. Then I'll be away. Then you'll be away. But in some shape or form, the podcast will be here each week because the president goes nowhere and doesn't slow down at all. It's busy, busy, busy all the time at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah, the show must go on as it does for President Trump, and I think this week in particular was really busy in terms of foreign policy stuff. We saw Prime Minister Netanyahu here, and we also saw President Zelensky, and I think he's clearly come a long way from that infamous Oval Office shouting match that you and I both covered back in February of last year. It seems kind of like a 180-degree turnaround by President Trump in terms of Zelensky.
Does, doesn't it? I mean, usually on the pod, we're talking about the strained and the fractious relationships between President Trump and various world leaders. And this week, whatever about that chat with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but with President Zelensky, it seemed to be surrounded with a warm, fuzzy feeling. We didn't have any live video interactions of their meeting, and perhaps that was done very deliberately. But the photographs that were released by the White House and approved by President Zelensky's office, there were big smiles all round.
I was speaking to someone kind of close to the administration yesterday, and they kind of described, at least in part, that Trump likes a winner, and Zelensky and Ukraine have shown that they can hold their own, and Russia's not making a tremendous amount of progress militarily. So I think that changed the situation as well, and I think President Trump over time has come to a realization that Putin, President Putin of Russia, has is perhaps not as willing to negotiate as he had initially thought when he came into office last year.
Yeah, I think there were a few things that made this meeting different. As you say, Ukraine is winning on the battlefield, but also while President Zelensky came with an ask on weapons, and we can talk in a minute as to just how successful that ask was, he's not his begging bowl isn't as huge as it was in that February meeting because the European Union and the UK as well have sort of stepped into this gap that's been left by the US hesitancy in terms of supporting Ukraine. So he's got a big bolstering, tens of billions of dollars from the European Union. Also, Ukraine's own defense technology has come on at a tremendous pace, its own relationships with the defense tech companies, with more modern types of missiles that are cheaper and faster to use. I was speaking to someone in the defense industry last week, and they said data is the new ammunition because the data that's being collected from the drones and the anti drone technology on the front lines in Ukraine is worth so much and is allowing those missiles and those weapons to just develop at such a tremendous pace. And I think, sort of partnership around there is something that President Zelensky is bringing to the table as well, that he can offer the US, that he can offer President Trump. And also, in between that February meeting and this week's one, they've met several times here at the White House, but also at various places, most recently just a few weeks ago in Ankara at the NATO summit. So I feel like their interpersonal relationship has probably developed as they've got to know each other a bit more. I mean, President Trump always says he's a kind of one-to-one guy, isn't he? So maybe that's developing here as well.
I think the part about Ukraine having something to offer the U.S. is really vital here because I think the lessons of the war in Ukraine and more recently of the war in Iran about the efficacy of spending multi-million or sometimes billion-dollar systems to combat drones. For example, the Iranian Shahed drone, which is also used in Ukraine, that cost 35 $100,000, more or less. Ukraine has really shown how to manage that threat as best as possible because they've been dealing with it so much longer than the US has versus Iran. I also think, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You know, given that Lindsey Graham, the late Senator Lindsey Graham, was such a champion of Ukraine's defense, in some way, it almost felt like his death. Of course, Zelensky was also here for his funeral service. That his death kind of gave him a bit of a push. You know, I think a lot of people in government, certainly on Capitol Hill, kind of wanted to honor Lindsey Graham's wishes to do what possible for Ukraine going forward, and I think that gave him some kind of unfortunate momentum, I guess one could call it.
Yeah, it was almost poetic, I think. You know, listening to some of the speeches at the memorial service on Capitol Hill for Lindsey Graham, listening to what was said at the funeral at the National Cathedral. And then I watched a lot, but not all because it went on for many hours, of the memorial service in South Carolina during the week as well, which was kind of the final goodbye to Lindsey Graham before he was laid to rest there. But the amount of times his, foreign policy, his hawkish position was referenced, and how much in particular Ukraine meant to him in the last few months. And obviously, that was his last foreign trip as well. He was in Ukraine meeting President Zelensky just in the couple of days before he died. That I think you're right. I think there was an impetus there for those who loved and respected Lindsey Graham to sort of have this mark the final push of his life and the things that he argued for and stood for. And of course there was plenty of other things that he stood for and represented, particularly on the domestic space, that perhaps people wouldn't agree with, but there was bipartisan support, and I would say respect as well, for what he was trying to do. And I think that's why we saw, I mean, what was it, 86 senators voted in that procedural vote to pass through the Russia sanctions bill, which he had been pushing for well over a year now. And all of a sudden, this big push, it was tabled and it passed.
And I think that's such a rare show of bipartisan support. The senators kind of backing Ukraine. That's actually quite rare in the United States these days.
Nowadays.
Yeah, where this wouldn't have been the case a few decades ago. But Ukraine and various other foreign conflicts really do split people on Capitol Hill. So I think there's certainly momentum for Ukraine here in Washington to match. It's stopping Russia's momentum on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Let's talk about the battlefield though and the weapons point for a minute, because I mean there was all this warm fuzziness around the two presidents meeting, but Zelensky still came with an ask for weapons, and I'm not sure that he got it.
I'm not sure either, and I think his ask comes at a particularly tricky time for the Trump administration because those Patriot missiles that he was asking for have seen a lot of use in the Gulf and against Iranian ballistic missiles, and there's a really finite supply. So I think even if the U.S. were to grant Ukraine a license to produce them domestically, as Trump had suggested back at the NATO summit, that's not a quick fix for Ukraine. I mean, it's a very complicated manufacturing process to get one of those done. So I think if he was asking, as has been reported, for 300 Patriots to be delivered to Ukraine by this winter, the U.S. at the moment really doesn't have 300 Patriots to spare, given everything that's happened in Iran.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the reporting in the Ukrainian media of what happened this week, and they were sort of suggesting that President Trump had been very sympathetic to President Zelensky's ask and that he wanted to help him, particularly because, it seems like there is a momentum now, and maybe this is the point at which they can force Russia back and into a better negotiating place, get them to the table for some sort of deal. But the Ukrainian media was reporting that President Trump said, yes, I'm sympathetic to that, but I just don't have it to give, as you're saying, Bernard. And so Zelensky kind of came away empty handed, not even with the promise of something, but, I'd love to help you guys, but I don't have enough for my own house kind of thing, which puts Ukraine, I think, now in a very interesting position as to what do they do, because there's only so much that they can achieve through, and it is big and it is significant, but through this more modern warfare that they've been using, the smaller missiles and the drone technology. But it was interesting as well to see that President Zelensky had gone for a big meeting at Lockheed Martin as well, one of the big defense firms here who makes these missiles. And again, a lot of this information didn't happen in public. We only got it because President Zelensky posted about it on X to tell us that this meeting had happened. But he was talking there again, not just about what they could sort of get from Lockheed Martin and buy, obviously, but what they could give them as well in terms of production tips and that key point about the data that they're collecting on the battlefield.
When I read those same reports, I kept thinking back to that Oval Office meeting back in February when Trump said, you have no cards. I think Ukraine very clearly has a card now that it's playing in terms of what it can offer. I mean, not just the United States, but I think especially other NATO European allies are really looking to Ukraine as having actually battle tested proven AI systems, for example. I mean, if you listen to David Petraeus, the former head of CENTCOM and the former head of the CIA, talk about it, the Ukraine is years ahead in some regards, having actually put this into practice for a long time. And I think that more than anything, perhaps besides the fact that they're doing well militarily, is really kind of pushing that momentum for Ukraine here in Washington, as the U.S. knows and has now realized after Iran, it has to catch up in that regard, and Ukraine can help in that way.
The other big ask that President Zelensky came with, not just the very important and urgent one around the missiles, though, was for this push to diplomacy, wasn't it? I mean, there are no active negotiations happening at the moment, even if President Trump regularly says, "Oh, I want to have a meeting of, me, Zelensky, and Putin, the three presidents together," which there's no likelihood of that happening at the moment. But I think a big win for Ukraine was this acknowledgement that the president's two key negotiators, his son in law, Jared Kushner, and his sort of special envoy for everything, as it seems, Steve Witkoff, will now go to Ukraine, probably in the next fortnight. And that sort of extraordinary revelation that they have never been there. They've been to Moscow a few times now in the course of, coming back into office for President Trump, but they've never been to Ukraine.
I think part of that is just kind of the incredibly massive remit that those two were given as kind of special envoys. They had the Gaza file. They've been very involved in the Iran negotiations on and off, and there's only so many places one could be.
I think that led in, a lot to that row in February of last year, wasn't it? When President Zelensky was, "Have you been to my country? Do you know? Have you seen? Have you seen the ruins? Have you seen, just what's going on there?" And they are very busy, but they have been to Moscow many times and not to Ukraine. And I think that's something that has irked President Zelensky in terms of, you need to see for yourself the destruction in my country. You need to rush into the basement shelters, the underground shelters every night for hours on end because of the pummeling Kyiv in particular has been taking in the last few weeks.
And I think a lot of people close to the White House and inside the White House have also come to that realization that Ukraine is here asking for help with negotiations, and Russia, frankly, isn't. And just this week we saw a massive rocket and drone attack across Ukraine by Russian forces. So I think just seeing someone like Laura Loomer, for example, who was kind of the voice of anti-Ukrainian sentiment within the MAGA movement for a while at the beginning of the administration, do a complete turnaround. I think that's reflecting across kind of wider circles that are around President Trump.
Interesting as well that she felt that some of the sort of louder voices in the MAGA movement she was suggesting may have been compromised by, sort of Russian propaganda or informational warfare, which, as we know, there's a lot of evidence of that happening in this country and in other countries recently. But she seemed to be suggesting that individuals had been targeted and that she was sort of on this grand investigation and she was going to present a big report on everything to President Trump in a few weeks.
Be curious what comes of that, because she was quite quick to admit that for a long time she fell under the sway of different news outlets and different social media figures that were kind of parroting Moscow's line with regards to Ukraine. So I'll be curious if that, they're obviously very close, her and President Trump. I'd be curious if we see kind of that sentiment pop up in the Oval Office one of these days.
Yeah, exactly. Well, she says she's doing a big report and she's going to meet him in the middle of August about that. So we'll keep our eyes open. But and also, I think after that visit that Kushner and Witkoff make to Ukraine, that there might be some impetus for movement on the diplomatic front as well. And after they do that, we'll be on the run in to the United Nations General Assembly in New York, which also is always a good chance for all of these world leaders to come together and have the sidebar meetings on the sidelines of that event, whatever they might say in the chamber.
So we'll just have to see what we're talking about next week, I suppose.
Yes, we no doubt will have plenty to talk about next week and for the weeks ahead because it is indeed a busy time. And we didn't even mention the midterm elections, which also are looming large. That usually occupies a lot of our discussions. But until next week, Bernd, have a great week.
See you later.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.